Welcome back to the tutorials, and I've got something this time that was a bit of a request here from someone that was looking at some other things I had online and on a blog. And this is an illustration from a long time ago in Photoshop. So the question really has to do with working with vector tools and shapes and modifying and use them in Photoshop. So I'll try a few things here about how I'd create something like this. Now if you look here at the layers, you'll see these are really vector shape layers. So as I click on them, you can see these are vector paths, and I like to do this quite a bit in Photoshop whenever I'm dealing with shapes like this that are smooth or geometric or have a lot of straight lines and things in them. It's really a great way to work. Plus you have the great use of colors in Photoshop's, blend modes, opacity, layer masks, and also layer styles, which gives us a lot of this kind of thing right here. So I want to show a bit about how this would come to be. Now to do that, I'll turn a few layers off here. Alright, and really we kind of start with this. Now no matter what you're doing, it's always a good idea to use photographic source material. So here is a photograph of a loaf of bread. So I was going to represent this in some way. Reproduce, one of those, wasn't sure which one. Okay, so it's kind of a good thing to start with something like this. You're not making it all up, even if what you're doing is going to be very simplified or stylized. And what I would do is, I've got some lines here turned on to be vanishing points. And they're kind of based on the photo. These, of course, are vector lines as well. So I could grab one of these and sort of move it down here, like that. And gets it all kind of going right where it needs to go. So if I turn on this image right here, it's all looking good. I think I'll kind of pull this one and kind of go like that. So the idea is this is a bit of a complex shape, but you need to reduce it down somewhat. And this really is it's kind of a long cube sort of shape, and I'll keep that in mind as I'm doing the perspective work here. So we'll start off with this slice, and when you're working with vector shape tools in Photoshop, you really need to use these tools down here. So we've got the path selection and the direct selection, same thing that you'd have in Illustrator, except that Photoshop has to name them a bit differently. So instead of the selection tool, it's the path selection tool. I guess they figured if they called it the selection tool, you might get it confused with pixel-based selections. But this is all, of course, vector-based. So for something like this, if we look at what I ended up with here, with this kind of shape, we'll turn a few of those things off, and that as well. There we go. So for something like this, I'm going to have it be basically this shape, but kind of extruded out. So what it would do then is take this, and I'm going to make a duplicate of it. So I'll move it over here a little bit. I'll make a duplicate, and right here on this vector shape layer, if I just option drag, I've got a duplicate right here on the same layer. So now at this point, I'm going to transform it into position and use my vanishing points and my perspective lines here that I've already set up as a guide, along with the photo here somewhat. So we do just a Command T to do a free transform of this path. That's, of course, a Control T if you're on the PC. So Command T right here, and you see I'm transforming just this path and not this path. So put it into position, and I want to match it up with the perspective lines that I have. Now I like doing right-click here, using skew. So I can take these and put these right where they need to be. And once you get these put into position, if you've seen any of my previous tutorials on this, they'll match right up. So there we go. So you can see right there, the bread, I'm going to right-click and do a scale, really fits in nicely to those perspective lines. And once you've got it fitting in there, now you need to scale it. You can't move it or else the perspective is destroyed, so I'll undo that. But you kind of have to scale it into position. So I'll kind of pull the sides down and pull it in like this and so on. and kind of get that right where it needs to be, kind of along with this shape right here. See, I'm sort of using this bread here as a guide, and the lines here that I've put in, and I'll pretend this is sort of the back end of the loaf. Maybe pull that in. I guess pull it in a little bit more, and that should work fairly well. All right, so that's going to represent the back end of the loaf right here. Now I need a piece that represents the front end of the loaf. Okay, so I'm on the same layer here. I'm going to grab this piece, and in case you're wondering, this can be made in a number of ways. You could make it in Photoshop or Illustrator. I actually made this by building one half of it with a pen tool, and then copying and duplicating that, and mirroring it, then putting them together and joining it. So however you make this piece here is fine. And I'm going to take and have this together. So notice how on the same shape layer, as you move the pieces around, as they come together, they'll kind of join up there like that. So once again, Command T to transform only this shape, not this shape. And I will right click and choose Skew to put it into position following the guidelines that I already have here. Now if you grab a point when you skew, you'll skew just that point, and say I can move it just like that. If you grab an entire side, I'm still on skew, you can move the entire side there. Okay, so I'm putting this into position. I'm going to pull this over here because I want to make sure I match things up so that the perspective is accurate. Okay, I think that's good. Now the perspective is accurate. I'm going to match it to what's happening here. So right click and do scale, and kind of pull this down. Let's see if I have this. Oh, that's not working. There we go. Pull that one. There we go. So pull that down, move that over, and like that. And I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if these ends connected, because that really is what I'm going to do. I'm going to connect all these here, and kind of think what kind of line would come over there. Would that match up there? That's good. Oops, didn't mean to move that. And so I think that's going to look okay. I think that's going to work just fine. Okay. Now I'll hit return. So you see I've got these two slices here right on the one shape layer. The truth is I really don't need this bread layer there, the photo, so I'll turn that off and kind of work with that. Now in order to join these up, an easy thing to do would be just to use the pen tool and create a shape that matches them up there. So I'll come over here to the pen tool, and I've noticed that the pen tool doesn't quite respond to the keyboard commands, modifying commands to add very much. I'm holding down Shift, and there's no plus sign. So if I were to use the pen tool right now, it would make a brand new shape layer. Now I don't want to do that. I want to just continue and add to this shape layer. So if it's not responding, and the pen tool for some reason never has, I'm going to come up here to my shape controls and click here and do Combine Shapes. I use New Layer as a default, so now I'm going to click on Combine Shapes. And now if I click and drag, you'll see I'm still on the same layer here. So I'm going to come here, just make a shape, and kind of round those corners so they are working well. Go up there and click. There we go. It's not quite perfect, but that's no problem. I'll get my Direct Select tool and just kind of fine tune these paths a little bit here. Just going to pull that out so that this extrusion, these sides kind of match up. I think I'll even zoom in. There we go. So I can look here and get those really nice and accurate. And of course, because this is a loaf of bread, it's not really straight and hard corners and all that. So I'm keeping that in mind, but still want to have them match up fairly nicely. And just get to use this, get to use my Bezier curves, and right here, kind of pull that out. Okay, so there we go. Right, so here we are. Pull that back in there, and so that's my full-on shape of the loaf there, built out of this back end and this front end, which is just the 2D slice of the bread, and then the shape that connects them. Now actually I think in this case it would be handy to join all of these. So I'm going to come over here and get the Path Selection tool. Make sure I select all three shapes by shift clicking. Okay, all three shapes are selected. And now in the current version of Photoshop, if you come up here to your shape options, you can click here where it says Merge Shape Components. So what that really means is it takes all these paths and kind of merges them all together, like Pathfinder or the Shape Builder tool in Illustrator. So I'll click that, and there you go. Now those are all three shapes merged into one. And that's how this shape right here gets built, and it looks nice and accurate and fits into the perspective of the scene. Now to finish these things off here, if you'll notice, I'll just turn this one off, and here's my actual loaf shape. So that's the one I used in the illustration, and this is how it was made. If I look at the layer styles here, you can see I've got a little bevel and emboss. There's the highlight side, a little shadow side. There's the inner shadow, and that's giving me this part here where it's darker along where it's touching the surface here, and this inner glow. Now, as I've always said, glows don't have to be bright, and highlights don't, or glows don't have to be bright, and shadows don't have to be dark. So you see this glow here is set to multiply with a darker color, and that gives this really nice, so this nice color right in here. So cancel that. Now for this shape right here on top, that gives a bit of this this area here. I'll show you how I did that, and that's just really using clipping masks. So for example, and there's the original loaf slice there on the back. So here's this one on the front, and you can see that it's using this one as a clipping mask, and you can see the various things that are on there. It even has this little drop shadow there, which is a light color. Just change the blend mode from multiply to screen, give it a lighter color, and there's a bit of lighter color right there, and that's as a drop shadow. So you can use these layer styles in Photoshop. They're great, but I urge you to not take the defaults, to change them and make them do what you want them to do. Because just by clicking something like drop shadow or bevel and emboss, everyone recognizes that. It's not anything cool. But if you can adjust them, you can really do a lot of cool things here. And of course, this this bread texture I've gotten here by this this standard Photoshop pattern right here. And of course, the default, if you look, is going to look like that. But by changing this to overlay to create all these blend modes, then that gives me the light and the dark, but allows the color to show through underneath. And taking the opacity down, it gives this nice little bread texture there. So for this bit along the top, I want to click this top part here, and that just shows you this part of where the edge of the bread, as it's kind of sticking out of the pan and kind of grows and cooks and bakes out, kind of goes past that to get this shape right here. There we go. That really is nothing more than just taking the pen tool and making some kind of random shape like this. But if you look closely, what you'll see is I'm really concerned about connecting it up here and here to get that nice edge. I don't really care what it does out here as long as it goes outside of this, because it's using this layer as a clipping mask. So right here you can see that edge right there, and that really is just a good bit of layer styles as well. This inner shadow, once again, is not dark because I changed the blending mode to screen, used a lighter color, and instead of using the standard like this, which makes it kind of flat along the edge, I choose this contour, which is a little bump, and that makes it kind of transparent here, and then there's the top of the bump, and then goes back down. That's this little peak right here. So the shadow doesn't go right to the edge, it's sort of offset a little bit. That's what this part means right here, as opposed to this flat one. And of course you can take, and if you move the distance, you can see how that distance kind of moves up around. So I did that just to give it a little bit of a highlight along there to kind of show that edge, and you can see a drop shadow and all that. So what's cool here is that even though there's a drop shadow, it's not going to appear anywhere out here because it's using this layer down here as a clipping mask. If I were to hold down Option and then I'll click to remove that from the clipping mask, you can see now that's where the shape goes, and that's where all those effects would be. So let me undo that. And while I'm on it, I'll show you one more thing here. Let's turn off these perspective lines. That looks a little better. So while I'm on this topic, I'll show you one more thing here. If anyone's ever wondered about opacity versus fill and what that does. So here's what I'll show you. This really works well in situations where you have layer effects on a layer. So you notice how if I take this fill back up to 100%, go. I'm not really going to see necessarily anything through it. In fact, I could take this and even change the color, make it something kind of crazy right there. There we go. So there's that fill at 100%, and that's that orange color on this layer. Now, if you take the opacity down, what you'll notice is that the layer effects go down, as well as whatever pixels are colored inside of the path. However, if you keep the opacity to 100% and you take down the fill, what happens is now the pixels inside the path go down in opacity, but the layer styles remain. So now my fill is at 0 and my opacity is 100%. So I'm seeing the layer styles of this inner glow and this outer glow and drop shadow and this inner shadow right here. So you can see that we'll turn those off. We're getting just those and not any color in here. And that's how that particular effect works together. Now, as kind of a final thing, you notice that things right here don't look that great. It looks like it's sort of floating on this tabletop. We want to connect it. And the way you connect it really is by working with the shadows and adding some shadows there. Now, here's one thing I want to caution everyone against. I see a lot of students do this, and it really is kind of a beginner mistake. One thing you don't want to do is click on this and do a drop shadow. So here's a standard drop shadow. It's black. It's awful because there's nothing really happening there. But notice how as I take that up, what you'll see, there we go, is that, let's do a little more distance here. There we go. So that doesn't really work as a cast shadow. What this basically says, if you were to do something like this, is that your bread is flat, two-dimensional, and this background here is a vertical, flat background. And this is just floating above with a little space in between. And then, of course, the direction that you change it here just kind of shows what your light source is coming from. But that's not what you want to do. What you want to suggest is that this is a three-dimensional object sitting perpendicular to this surface here, which is horizontal, and this is vertical, and that goes back in the background. You will not get this by using a drop shadow. So please stop doing it. You need to do a little bit more work here, but it's not that hard, and I'll show you how that works. So we'll cancel that. What you have to do is remember this is actually sitting on the surface. And as it's sitting on the surface, there would be this contact area where the bottom of the bread is making contact with the table. So if I turn back on my perspective lines, I can kind of get a sense of where that would be. See that? And what I do then is I create this shape here called shadows. And this is the shape. So let's actually turn on one of these slices of bread here. There we go. So there's a slice of bread right there on the table, and then here is the loaf on the table. And to make these look like they're connecting, I just use the pen tool and I create a shape like this, use rounded corners, and this is of course underneath the loaf. There's my loaf layer, here's this shadows layer. Now this layer, this shape is not going to be seen, but what is going to be seen are its shadows that will connect the loaf here. And there are two ways I like to do this. One is an outer glow and one's a drop shadow. Now remember, glows don't have to be bright. So with this, in this case here, I've used multiply, and I'm using a color taken from this table right here. And I'm using multiply, and with this outer glow, what that does is it creates something called ambient occlusion. If you do any work with 3D models, you'll know what that means. Meaning that it's not just a simple cast shadow, but as light hits, it kind of gets scattered and occluded. And parts that are sort of tucked away from the light, the area gets occluded and darker. So this type of thing here, where it's like this dark glow or scattering, is called ambient occlusion, really helps to kind of connect things right there. And then of course there's the actual drop shadow itself. Now remember that this is all based on this shape. So the drop shadow comes out here like this. For something like this, I would do, say let's take a look at this drop shadow once again. Notice that that's right at 90 degrees. So the lights, if the light's coming straight down, it's going to cast on the other side right there. And that gives me just this nice dark line right here. And you can adjust that as you want. Here's this drop shadow. I could make a little sharper of a line by taking the size down. And now I get a little sharper of a line right there with that drop shadow. Or I could even take the drop shadow I was looking for. There we go. So if I take the distance up, take the spread up, you can see how you can adjust what that line looks like. Take the distance back down, and now it's a bit, it's a bit a bit closer in there. So you can adjust the way that shadow looks. Now I was going for something kind of soft and diffuse, no hard cast shadows or anything else like that. Well, that's how this comes together by using a lot of vector tools. So I hope that brings some of that a little more into light, because this is kind of an interesting process. This is not my usual look here. It's kind of simplified and stylized, but that's what the client wanted and that's what I was going for. And I do like to use Photoshop's vector tools really to their fullest capacity. And you can see that as you do it, you can get some really cool, nice results, and even a lot more than you can in Illustrator, because with Illustrator, you don't have the option of doing work this easily with blending modes and reflections and soft edges and textures and all this. You can do it, but there's a lot more work to it. And Photoshop is really designed to do this. So don't forget about Photoshop's vector tools. They are a great addition to your illustration work. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and stay tuned for the next one.